If you look at a map of Middle-earth, it's impossible to miss the mountain ranges. The Misty Mountains, the Grey Mountains, the Blue Mountains, the White Mountains, and of course, the oddly shaped mountains around Mordor. They almost perfectly divide the land into different neat sections. But not all mountains are so well known. In fact, despite appearing on the map, they're pretty much never mentioned in the story. In this episode, we're talking about the Mountains of Mirkwood, the Haunted Mountains. Mirkwood isn't sparse when it comes to geographical features. There's the East Bight, the Forest River, the Enchanted River, the Old Forest Road, Dol Guldur in the south, and finally, there's the Mountains of Mirkwood. You can find them in the northern middle of Mirkwood, just above the Old Forest Road, yet a fair distance south of the Forest River. In terms of width, they stretch across much of the forest, but they do not run from end to end. They're also the source of the Enchanted River, which meets with the Forest River a little further to the north. In the Second Age, the Mountains of Mirkwood were known as Emenduir. In Sindarin, this means Dark Mountains. However, it should be noted that while the Mountains of Mirkwood were labelled as mountains on the map, Tolkien does actually describe them more as high hills. At the time, the name Dark Mountains had nothing to do with the mountains being evil, but rather it was because the mountains were covered in dense fir trees, meaning they looked dark from a distance. From the early years of the First Age, Mirkwood, then known as Greenwood, was inhabited by elves, specifically Nandoran elves of Teleran background, who had abandoned the great journey to the west. Around 750 of the Second Age, these Nandor, now commonly known as Sylvan Elves, were joined by a company of Sindar who had originated in Doriath. This company was led by Orifer, who may have been a Doriathrim noble, and he would become the King of Greenwood, and he would make his capital at Amon Lank, the hill that would later become known as Dol Guldur. But Amon Lank did not end up being a permanent capital. Orifer, who was keen on his people living a rustic existence, free of disruption from the outside world, found himself disturbed on two fronts. To the west was the growing power of Khazad-dûm and Galadriel and Celeborn's rising influence over the Forest of Lothlorien, and to the east and south was the growing power of Sauron. Orifer wanted little to do with either of these situations, and finding Amon Lank to be vulnerable, he decided to move his capital northwards. He did this not once, not twice, but 3 times, and by the end of the Second Age, he had moved his capital to Emenduir, and his people mostly dwelled in the western glens of those mountains. We don't know when this third move took place, so we don't know whether the move to Emenduir finally satisfied Orifer, but this is where the Woodland Elves were dwelling at the end of the Second Age. To his credit, Orifer joined his army to the Last Alliance, but in the war that followed, he and 2/3 of his army were killed, an extraordinary loss of life. Despite the losses, Thranduil's battered army was still far too large to assail for the orcs that would later ambush Isildur at the Gladden Fields. As the new King of Greenwood, Thranduil seemed content with dwelling in Emenduir. However, we're told that he was always of the belief that the vigilance of the kings of men would fail, and that the shadow would arise again. This happened perhaps earlier than Thranduil expected, and it happened far closer to home, for around the beginning of the second millennium of the Third Age, a darkness appeared at Orifer's old capital at Amon Lank. This was the Necromancer, originally thought to be one of the Nazgûl, and later revealed to be Sauron. By 1050, his shadow had spread enough for men to start calling Greenwood Mirkwood, and Amon Lank would become known as Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery. Once again, we're not given exact dates, but we're told as the shadow spread north through the forest, Thranduil withdrew before it, meaning that the Sylvan Elves abandoned Emenduir. They would eventually settle in the northeast corner of the forest, shielded by the Forest River, and there Thranduil would create halls that were meant to resemble Menegroth in Doriath, although they could not compare in beauty. The Woodland realm now really only spanned the northern reaches of the forest. There would be no more retreat. As for Emenduir, it was renamed to Emennufuin, the Mountains Under Night, but they were more commonly referred to as the Mountains of Mirkwood. So what became of the Mountains of Mirkwood? Well, Tolkien gives only a short description, that after the elves abandoned them, Sauron's shadow spread through them, and quote, the Emenduir became a haunt of many of his most evil creatures. We're never told what creatures exactly. One would assume that there were orcs, trolls, and wargs. Of course, Mirkwood is perhaps most infamous for its giant spiders, and given that spiders often historically inhabited mountains, and that Thorin's company ran into some on the elf path that wasn't that far north of the mountains, one could assume that the Mountains of Mirkwood may have been infested with them. In the map of the Wilderland from The Hobbit, the Mountains of Mirkwood are entirely surrounded by spiderweb drawings, but that said, spiders also dwelt both north and south of the mountains. There might have also been other awful monsters. After all, Tolkien specifically says that the mountains were haunted by many of Sauron's most evil creatures. We know that there were corrupted animals in Mirkwood such as black squirrels, which were described as inedible, as well as large, aggressive black bats. Bats were related to vampires, Sauron's ancient servants, so if any of them were still around, they could have made their abodes in those mountains. There may have also been other corrupted spirits, perhaps even undead, who might have roamed the abandoned halls of the Woodland Elves. The last bit of evidence we have that indicates how corrupted the Mountains of Mirkwood might have been is the existence of the Enchanted River, which had its source in those mountains. When the river is encountered in The Hobbit, it's described as being completely black, and that merely coming into contact with the water is enough to render someone unconscious for days. This is what happened to Bombur in The Hobbit, and the other dwarves were forced to carry him around. If you were travelling alone and were unlucky enough to touch the water, well, you might just immediately drown, but if you were lucky enough to fall onto the bank, well, you might still just die of dehydration depending on how long you were unconscious. Ultimately, the Mountains of Mirkwood don't really play a role in the story. They may have been a staging ground for the attacks on the Woodland realm during the War of the Ring, but we don't really know. After Sauron's fall, the Elves of Lothlorien led by Galadriel and Celeborn assaulted and destroyed Dol Guldur and cleansed the Hill of Evil. This ended the Dark Fortress as a font of corruption, and Thranduil and Celeborn would meet shortly afterwards and rename Mirkwood as Erin Lasgallen, the Wood of Green Leaves. The Woodland realm was also designated all the forest between the northern border and the Mountains of Mirkwood. But I imagine that the Mountains of Mirkwood remained an unpleasant place for many years to come. A forest such as Mirkwood would be difficult to cleanse, and mountains in the midst of those forests would be twice as difficult. I expect that many of Sauron's surviving creatures in the forest might have fled there, not least the giant spiders who, as the brood of Shelob, had no qualms about existing independently of Sauron. In the end, I wouldn't be surprised if the Mountains of Mirkwood remained a dangerous place for centuries to come into the Fourth Age, perhaps one of the last truly haunted places in Middle-earth. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. If you have any suggestions for places on the map that you'd still like me to talk about, please let me know. When I started this series, I wanted to talk about the places that were lesser known, but still had enough information floating around about them to be worth making a video about. I feel like I'm running low on that front. Either the remaining places are very well known, or have basically nothing worth talking about. So I put it up to you, dear viewer. Cheers, farewell, and remember, the Mountains of Mirkwood is kind of a clunky name. They should have been renamed the Mirk Mountains, or the Murky Mountains, or the Mountwood of Mirktons, or something like that.